Thank you for joining us for what I think you will find a very timely and very engaging conversation about Putin's brutal war against Ukraine. I'm really pleased to be joined by Anne Applebaum. I can't think of a better person to talk about these issues than Anne Applebaum. She's a Pulitzer-prize winning historian. She is a staff writer now at The Atlantic. She's written extensively over many years on the topics we will talk about today, and also has a Maryland connection through Johns Hopkins University. I'm proud to have her as a constituent, and we're lucky to have her here today. We're going to talk about why Putin invaded Ukraine, why it's important to Americans, and what we should be doing now. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to do this. Thank you.
Well, the two of us were at the Munich conference really days before the war started. Why did Putin do this, and what does Putin want?
Putin very much sees the world in black and white. He understands his role as the leader of Russia, an autocracy where he is the unchallenged leader. And he understands the main challenges to his authority coming from the Western world, from Europe, from the United States, from the democracies. He therefore sees Ukraine, which is a country that was essentially a Russian colony for several hundred years. It was part of the Russian Empire, then it was part of the Soviet Empire. Then in the last 30 years, it's created its own sovereign state. And it's also created a very powerful identity that's bound up with the idea of democracy and integration into the Western world. So Ukraine is a country that has wanted to be its own state, actually also for many hundreds of years. It didn't manage to achieve that. But Putin sees Ukraine's desire for sovereignty and democracy as a personal challenge to him. So his autocracy, which is based on the idea of the superiority of his system, is challenged by this upstart state, a former Russian colony, which doesn't want to be part of the Russian world anymore, by which he doesn't mean the Russian language world or the Russian cultural world, but Russia's autocracy. And so Ukraine for him has been an irritant for a long time. It's a symbol of a democracy movement that he can't crush at home. He's made several earlier attempts to undermine, to conquer Ukraine. Whether through manipulating Ukrainian politics, whether through corruption in 2014, through the invasion and occupation of Crimea, you might remember. And now this war is really his last stand of saying, I'm going to conquer all of Ukraine, I'm going to subjugate it, I'm going to make it part of my country.
So he sees Ukraine as really an extension of Russia. He wants to sort of eliminate an independent Ukrainian identity, and certainly an identity that associates itself with the West, with the rule of law, with democracy, with market economies.
Yes, and I should say the invasion is also a challenge to those things. He is really a very ambitious dictator, and his ambition is to rewrite the rules of the world economy so that things that we assumed were accepted and that we had held sacred, whether it's the rule of law, whether it's the importance of human rights, whether it's the inviolability of borders, that borders can only be changed through mutual agreement and so on. All of that he wants to undermine. He wants to show that all of that is this American, Western, liberal idea of how the world works, that all of that is for the birds, it's all rubbish, it can be undermined by somebody who's willing to use violence. And so part of what he's doing is seeking to undermine the world order that we have all lived in all of our lives, and we are so used to that we can hardly imagine anything else.
I think you anticipated a little bit of my next question, because here we are witnessing a gross violation of sovereignty through his invasion of Ukraine. But I guess the question many Americans have is, why is this important to us? Why is this important to Americans? So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on exactly what is at stake here.
So why is America powerful and wealthy and successful? There are many reasons. One is the great talent and ingenuity of Americans. Another reason is that since the Second World War, we have helped construct a world in which there are rules of trade, in which there are laws about borders, in which there's respect for diplomacy, in which acts of random violence, at least in theory, can be punished. in which there are international courts, that disputes are solved by arbitration. This hasn't always been true, and we haven't always guarded that as well as we could have done. But we are the main beneficiaries of that international system. It's our trade with Europe or our trade with other countries. All of that is made possible by this rules-based world. Russia seeks to undermine that rules-based world, and it seeks to knock the world back to a moment when might makes right and only the strongest nations get to decide anything. And in that world, the United States our economy is no longer safe, our international trade is no longer safe. The things that we depend on for security are no longer certain. And this, really, as I said, he's challenging Ukraine and by the grotesque, actually, violations of human rights that we've seen in Ukraine. He's challenging those rules and those institutions that we created. And it's really very much in our interest for him not to win. And I should say that if he did win, if he were able to conquer and subjugate Ukraine and turn Ukraine into a kind of concentration camp, which seems to be his goal, then others would see what he had done and do the same. And it would be a lesson to China, it would be a lesson to Venezuela, it would be a lesson to Cuba, it would be a lesson to Belarus, and a whole series of other autocracies who are watching this war very carefully to seeing what it is that Russia can get away with so that they can make similar kind of decisions.
Right. I think authoritarian leaders around the world are paying very close attention to whether Putin succeeds. Now, he certainly seems to have failed in his initial goal, which was to have Russian troops quickly take over Kyiv, and he's failed at that. So where do you go from here? Where does he go? I mean, you've been watching Putin for a very long time. If Plan A failed, what is Plan B?
So I was just in Kiev. I interviewed the president, Zelensky. I went with my editor, and we published in The Atlantic, and we asked him this. And we were there about 2 weeks ago, which is just at the moment when they'd achieved this really extraordinary feat. Nobody expected them to be able to resist Russian invasion and resist the occupation of Kiev that they did. But what President Zelensky was then afraid of was a Russian regrouping in eastern Ukraine and an assault from that side of the country that would be more concentrated. Instead of from 6 different places, it would be one assault, and they would try to encircle the Ukrainian army, take over the eastern and southern part of the country and occupy that. It's maybe important for people to understand what it means when Russia occupies a territory. It's not just that they're interested in the land, or the buildings, or even the factories. They have been truly devastating these areas. In the city of Mariupol, they've knocked down 90% of the buildings. In many places, they have arrested and killed mayors and political leaders. They have used random violence against citizens. They have deported citizens from Ukraine to Russia. We don't know what's happened to them. They have removed Ukrainian flags, put up Russian flags, and beat up people who even own Ukrainian language textbooks in their house. So they're looking at very much at changing completely the nature of the places that they occupy, and if need be, killing the people who object to them. So the Ukrainians understand this as really not just a war about territory or where the border is going to be, but it's really existential. It's about whether Ukrainians are even allowed to exist in that part of the world. And so the fear is that he would come from the east, he would occupy large swaths of territory, maybe not the whole country, but a third of the country, half the country, and make Ukraine unviable and unstable. So really what has to happen now is the Ukrainians need to push them all the way out of the country so that they're over the borders and so that they are not able to exert that kind of influence and wreak that kind of destruction.
Right. I think it's essential that we ultimately document all the war crimes and ultimately hold Putin accountable. But as you know, before we can do that, we got to push him back,
Yes.
as you say. How would you assess the current state of America's and our NATO partners' support for the people of Ukraine? As you know, President Biden has just proposed another round of $33 billion in emergency assistance. You met with President Zelensky. What's your sort of most recent report on how things are going in terms of weapon systems delivery to Ukraine, the sanctions that we've imposed on Putin, his cronies in Russia, and isolating Russia in places like the UN Human Rights Council.
So about 3 weeks ago, even as I was in Kiev, there was still a pretty big distinction between what the Ukrainians wanted and what Washington seemed to be delivering. And the Ukrainians wanted more, and Washington was very slow. In the early part of this war, I think, as you know, people weren't really sure would the Ukrainians really fight back, would the weapons be useful, what was the right way to aid the Ukrainians, how were they going to fight, and there was a lot of uncertainty. My impression is, from talking to people both here and in Ukraine, that in the last 2 weeks, that's changed, and the level and nature of weapons coming not only from the United States but also from European countries is rising both in quality and in number. The deliveries are happening more quickly. The Ukrainians are now training on American-made and other NATO-made weapons outside of the country. They're bringing them back in, and they're already going into the field and using them. So my impression is that sort of some initial hiccups in the relationship have improved a lot. The Ukrainians speak extremely highly of Biden and of the Biden administration. They work very well with the Pentagon, with the Army, with others who've been helping them. And so, that seems to be going unusually well. And I should say that, just so that your constituents, or I should say your other constituents, since I'm one of them, know, this is a really unprecedented effort. There's really nothing that anybody can think of since really maybe the program that we aided the British in World War II before we entered the war back in the 1940s. And really you have to go back that far to find that kind of unprecedented effort, which I think is an indication of just how important a geopolitical moment many here in Washington consider this to be. So that's going very well. I mean, sanctions had less of an immediate impact than many people had hoped. But the longer term impact, both of the sanctions and the refusal to buy Russian oil, which the US has done, and all kinds of import restrictions that it's hoped will make it much more difficult for the Russians to produce new weapons and to produce new goods. It's not so much, these flashy stories about oligarchs having their yachts taken away and the Gucci store is closing in Moscow, but actually what really matters are these import restrictions that will take a lot longer to kick in and really be felt. And again, I hear sort of mixed versions of that. Some people say, well, nothing's happened, and some people say, but wait, it just will. And so it may be that it hasn't happened quite fast enough. But certainly the level of sanctions, and I should say that the unity of the democratic world, not just Europe, but others, has been really impressive and heartwarming to see. And that's another thing that we should be grateful to the Biden administration for doing, because they managed to bring people together in a way that nobody thought was still possible. So that's all very important. There are still countries. I mean, famously China, most notably and worryingly India and other countries who haven't quite signed on to this. And maybe over the long term, Russia will find a way around sanctions. But they have certainly to date been harsher than anyone expected they would be.
Right. No, I think, and thank you for making that distinction between some of the short-term impact of sanctions, but the longer-term impact of cutting off Russia's imports of some critical material. So, as I mentioned, the two of us were in Munich just days before the invasion was launched, and the Biden administration was letting our European and other partners know that we thought Putin would invade, and everybody hoped that wasn't true, but it also gave everyone some time to begin contingency planning. You really just referred to the fact that the Biden administration has helped unite the world. Can you talk about how NATO as an organization has in many ways sort of rediscovered its purpose and why it's so important?
I was actually worried by the Munich Security Conference in the immediate aftermath because there was a lot of unity. You're right, and people were sort of all on the same page, saying it's terrible that Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And then you remember Zelensky appeared and made a speech, which was actually rather bitter, in which he said, "I'm glad you're all unified, but we were fighting alone." And there was a moment when I worried that there wasn't the support was more fictitious than real. and that there wouldn't be, there wouldn't be the kind of help that Ukraine needed, especially because at that moment there was still a lot of skepticism about what would happen. But since then, I do think that NATO, which includes, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Central and Eastern European countries, Poland, the Baltic states, have all in different ways really made some remarkable changes in their politics in some cases, and both verbally but also in terms of supplying money and weapons have stepped up to the plate in a way that nobody would have predicted, even days before. There was a really remarkable moment when the German chancellor made a speech saying, Germany really does need a real army now. It needs planes that fly and ships that sail. And famously, the German army had sort of deteriorated. And he called for, tens of billions of dollars worth of war, or euros worth of spending. The French are now delivering heavy weapons and tanks to Ukraine. The Poles have been doing that all along. And so there is a feeling that this is something that NATO, which has been an organization many people questioned the purpose of its existence since the Cold War ended, has come together, is working together in a way that is really quite heartening. I mean, there are one or two exceptions, and there's a part of the German political system that's not happy about it, and there's objections in other places. But by and large, the shift is quite remarkable.
You mentioned some countries, you mentioned China and some others that have provided at least some sanctions relief or have not been fully on board with the Biden administration, clearly on the sanctions. A number of us have been urging the administration to be a little more forward-leaning in terms of secondary sanctions. In other words, sanctioning countries that are helping Russia, evade sanctions. Do you have an opinion on that?
I don't know how technically possible that is and how easy that would be to apply. Certainly, if we could focus on particular industries, particularly the natural resources industries that Russia depends on so much, yes, I think that could be very effective. I mean, I know that the Chinese are worried that there will be a spill-off on them. I think they, like everybody else, did not expect this level of Western unity. They didn't expect this level of sanctions. They didn't expect Ukraine would do so well. And they may also be now recalculating their support for Russia, which was quite loud, actually. In the run-up to the war, there was actually a joint statement between Putin and Xi that implied that they would work together. China made very ambivalent noises about Ukraine in the first few days of the war. Has been quieter since. And so, yes, I do think that indicating that we're taking this seriously, that it's long-term, that it will last as long as the war lasts, and as long as this kind of violence lasts, will do us a lot of good in terms of the credibility that we attain, if this should happen again in the future.
So you mentioned that from Putin's perspective, one of his perceived threats of Ukraine was a Ukraine that, may one day be part of the EU, that was looking to the West. And as a result of Putin's invasion, we now have countries like Finland and Sweden asking to join.
The great irony is that this war that was designed to show that NATO is a paper tiger and to undermine the West and make the definitive statement that the Western unity was a fiction has actually resulted in the revitalization of NATO, in the greater cooperation of Western countries. And as you say, both Finland and Sweden, these are two countries that, although they're part of Western Europe and other institutions, have not technically been part of the military alliance, both now want to join. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are others.
Right, no, I mean, it just seems to be a huge strategic miscalculation. So can you talk a little bit more now about what you're talking about in terms of defining the ultimate goals and success, which is essentially pushing Putin and the Russian forces out of Ukraine. There were parts of Ukraine, as you know, that they had effective control of even before this stage of the war. But, at one point, at the beginning of the war, we were all talking about having to arm guerrilla fighters, right, in that team. And now we're talking about, a much more effective resistance, Ukrainian military. how do you see this playing out? How long is this going to last?
So this is really the million-dollar question, and I don't have an answer. It's something I'm writing about now, which is how to think about how it should end. Obviously, the safest way for it to end for Ukrainians is for the Russians to be evicted from the country, and not only from the territory they control right now, since that they've gained since February 24th, but also at the very least the eastern territories in Donbass, which they've occupied for the last 8 years. And the farther that, and the more effectively the Ukrainians can push them back, and there's some signs this week anyway that the Russian offensive is faltering a little bit, but the more that they can be pushed back, the more, the better position the Ukrainians will be when there is eventually a negotiation. There will eventually be a negotiation, the war eventually will end. And it will end when the Russians no longer feel that it's worth fighting. It may, and that can happen in a number of ways. Either Putin could simply declare some kind of victory, we defended our territory in Donbass or something like that and go home. Or it could end with a challenge to his power or his authority in Russia. And that's I have absolutely no evidence that that will happen, but there is a long history of change in Russia following military defeats, whether in 1917, in 1905 actually, and again in the 1980s after the war in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So it's not impossible, and it's something that we should keep in mind as a possibility. I mean, really, what has to happen is that Russia needs to change its I want to say change its attitude, but that makes it sound like an angry teenager. But it has to change its its stance towards Ukraine and towards Europe, and it needs to stick to its own borders, and it needs to focus inward on restoring the Russian economy and Russian prosperity, and not sacrifice those things in favor of invading foreign countries.
Right, and this raises a question about Putin's total monopoly over information, because one of the great freedoms that we enjoy and most of us respect here in the United States is freedom of the press. But by all accounts, Putin has been quite successful at putting up his iron curtain against information. Yes, people are very creative and a lot of ingenuity trying to get around it, but most of what I've seen suggests that Putin still has a majority of the Russian people believing his side of the story. What do you see on that, and what more can we be doing, if anything, through technology or other means to try to break through that iron curtain?
So I've been writing about the Russian state's takeover of television and the rest of the media for 20 years. I mean, it was a long process. They did it slowly. Some of it was opaque, but in essence, you now have every major television station that people can easily watch, and every major website that people can easily find, with the exception of YouTube, is now state-controlled. And so that's, and this regime is now putting out propaganda 24 hours a day. That's mostly what they do. Judging, therefore, what Russian public opinion actually is quite difficult, because if you see only one alternative and you are told there are no other alternatives, and if you're told, well, you believe in this war or you go to jail, people have a lot of incentive not to think about anything else. So they accept what has been given to them. I'm not sure that translates into active, sort of enthusiastic support for the war. And in fact, there evidence is to the contrary, that even the soldiers who are fighting are ambivalent. There's a very good article just today by a colleague of mine writing about Ukrainian encounters with Russian soldiers. And one of the things the Russian soldiers often say, we're doing this for the money. We have debts, we have to pay them back, so we join the army. So there's it isn't clear that there's a big ideological, enthusiasm for this fight. But yes, it's true. Putin does have a monopoly over Russian information space, almost total. They've now banned except for YouTube, most Western social media. And I think that that's an area where we, the United States, plus European allies, plus the huge now Russian diaspora. Lots and lots of Russians have left Russia. The ones who opposed the war, many have left. They're all over the place. They're in Europe. They're in Turkey. They're in Georgia. They're in Warsaw. And I think there is a lot of room for creativity in terms of helping to build up alternative media, helping to build up alternative television, coming up with ways for Russians to access these things. I mean, many of them have VPNs. This is a way of reading, pretending you're making the computer think you're in a different country. For those who don't know, and mirror sites. There are ways of getting around the internet firewalls, and pushing those, promoting those, making sure that there is an alternative Russia, so that what people see on television isn't the only version of history that's available in Russia, or the only version of contemporary events that's available in Russia. The United States actually does spend a lot of money on information, on messaging to the world, but it tends to be scattered in different pits of the government. I mean, some of it's the State Department, maybe some of it's the CIA, some of it's here and there. This would be a really good moment to try and galvanize that, to pull some of it together and to begin thinking more creatively about how we reach people in places like Russia and not only Russia, with alternate news, alternate information, and even alternate entertainment, as a way of giving people alternatives when they're locked inside a single, a kind of monotone world.
No, I appreciate you mentioning that. I do think that this is a moment for that. And also, thank you for sort of reminding us that there are thousands and thousands of Russians who are putting their own lives at risk to protest Putin's war. So one last piece I want to talk about was the energy dimension, right? Because obviously Putin continues to benefit from the sale of oil and even more gas and the dependency of so many countries. Can you talk about how you see that playing out right now? And we do see many of our European partners seeming to make genuine and serious efforts to kick the habit.
So yes, I mean, it's important maybe for Americans to understand that there are several European countries, notably Germany, but also Italy, and also several East European countries, Bulgaria, Poland, and others, who have Russian pipelines coming into their countries, and that's their main, or at least a large part of the source of their gas. And without that, they don't have easy alternative sources. And so for them, it's a really big sacrifice to cut that off, because they will then have extremely high energy prices, even higher than the ones we have here, and maybe shortages. And it's very hard for any democratically elected government, as these all are, to tell people we're about to cut off your gas. And so it's a genuinely difficult decision. However, there has been a lot of work. Some work was even being done before the war, but there's been some work done on looking for alternatives, whether from the Middle East or from there's gas in Norway has gas, and some other countries do too. Finding more efficient ways of getting that into Europe. I was just told today that there's the beginnings of a possibility of genuine oil embargo. So we already have an oil embargo on Russia. We of course don't have the gas pipeline issue, but we don't have, and it's possible that Europe in the next few days will join that as well. They've already done a coal embargo, which is also important in Europe. They're doing an oil embargo, and I hope that there will be gas pipeline alternatives at least by the end of the summer. And it's a really, really important issue because, of course, even with the sanctions, even with Western companies leaving Moscow, Putin still has billions of dollars coming into the country every day thanks to the sale of oil and gas. And so that's a big reason why he continue to prosecute this war, even though it's costing him a tremendous account. And I should say, there is a connection between this issue and the climate change issue that so many talk about. I mean, really, that we now have more than one reason to begin a real shift away from fossil fuels, because fossil fuels, not only in Russia but in Venezuela, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries around the world, fossil fuels really often are a kind of engine of autocracy, because they mean that if a tiny number of people control them, then those are the people who have total power, especially in smaller countries, but in large ones as well. And really the moment for shifting away from these things and finding alternatives has never been, it's never been more important, I should say.
Right. I mean, many of us, have focused appropriately on the climate change case, but this clearly underscores there's a big national security dimension to it, and a pocketbook issue. Right now, everyone sees just how vulnerable they are to the world price of gas and oil, and what one dictator can do to change it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a good moment because these things are connected. I mean, there's a reason why countries like Russia have never been that interested in climate change or in pushing those issues, and there's a reason why. As I said, there's a reason why so many autocracies have the source of the ruling class's power is its control over natural resources, or monopoly of those things.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this as we get to the close of our conversation. Is there anything more that the Congress in the United States should be doing? I think you rightly pointed out that several weeks ago there seemed to be a sort of gap between what the Ukrainians thought they should be getting and what they were getting. I'm hoping we're closing that gap. But is there anything more that you think we should be doing?
So again, the provision of heavy weapons. I know that there's an argument over this now. I hope that eventually we can lend the Ukrainians planes, and also anti-aircraft and anti-missile technology that will help them protect their cities, which have been bombarded so badly by the Russians. I should also say that I think there are opportunities for really ordinary people to help too. There are a lot of really great charities that have done tremendous work in helping people through this conflict. There's a Ukrainian charity called Razom, R-A-Z-O-M, which it's an old charity. It's been around for a long time and it's really stepped up to the plate in this conflict. There's a Polish charity called PAH, Polska Akcja Humanitarna, Polish Humanitarian Action, which has done an amazing job with refugees on the border. That's another organization that people can contribute to. And then if you really want to help, there's another one called Come Back Alive. You can find it, Come Back Alive, just type that in, Ukrainian charity. And that helps Ukrainian veterans. It provides things like night vision equipment and body armor for people who are fighting. You're not buying weapons, but there are there are lots of ways in which people can contribute, and I think by contributing and by informing yourself about the conflict, you're also helping. You're helping support this extraordinary attack on a highly developed country that has its very clear sense of independence and feels so much. They feel that they have so much in common with us, and I think they do.
So thank you for sharing your expertise and your experience. Now I'm reminded exactly why I wanted to talk to you and to help inform our constituents and people around the country. Is there anything you want to add in closing?
No, but I hope that people keep reading about it, they keep up with it. It even helps the Ukrainians to know that people care somewhere else in the world.
Listen, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.